Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Another video for you. Of course, I want to bring you all the updates as quickly and as current as I can. I am recording here again in the evening. It is 10 o'clock p.m. on the East Coast in the United States on February 26th. Well, a lot of developments, of course, if you're following the situation in Ukraine. The Russians are advancing. The U.S. propaganda mill is, of course, working overtime to say that the Russians are falling short of their objectives. They're not able to move as quickly, move as efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. Whether or not that's actually true remains to be seen. It certainly seems that, at least from the outset, it seemed like this was going to be a fairly quick operation, or at least the Russians expected it to be. We are now at the end of day three, and it's not totally clear if this is really going to be an efficient and clean and quick operation. It does seem that they're getting bogged down. But again, as I've said many times before, I don't really consider myself a military expert. I'm not a military guy. If anything, I abhor most military men. So I would leave it to the military people to say whether or not this is good or bad for the Russians. But it does seem to be taking quite a long time for them to secure the capital. Kiev remains under threat, at least at this hour. Air raid sirens are going off. Of course, there's reports of fighting on the outskirts of the city, within 20 to 30 kilometers of the Kiev proper. So again, it on the one hand seems like it's a matter of time, and on the other hand, it's not yet entirely clear just how ugly this might get if the Russians get bogged down in some kind of you know, building to building, house to house, street fighting, guerrilla fighting kind of situation. Boy, it could get extremely, extremely bloody. But again, let's hope that we don't have to see that kind of a scenario playing out. Now, at least as of now, the reports are that President Zelensky remains in Kiev. Um, Allegedly, he's rejected an offer from the United States to whisk him and his family out of the country. I'm skeptical whether that's actually true or if that's just more US propaganda. Remember, we are also, and by we, I mean the United States and those of us in the West, we are also, just like the Russians, subjected to an extremely sort of full spectrum kind of media blitzkrieg of disinformation and war propaganda to get everybody frothing at the mouth about war with Putin, as if that couldn't potentially spell the end of human civilization. So we have to be very skeptical also of everything that we're reading, and that is true for Russia's military gains. It's true for any offers of aid to Ukrainians and to Zelensky himself. So if it is true, though, that Zelensky is fashioning himself to be a hero and or potentially a martyr here, this adds another layer of complexity for the Russians. It would have been much, much cleaner and easier for Putin and for Moscow sort of strategic planners and those who are in charge of the PR and the marketing for all of this. If Zelensky would have run away, if he would have looked cowardly, certainly not going to look good for the Russians if he stands up and is able to fashion for himself this sort of profiles in courage kind of character. So we shall see. The TV personality becomes the real life hero. It's almost sickeningly ironic. And, anyway, we don't need to go too far in that direction. Um, what could be the strategic objectives for Putin? Again, whether or not I know much about military is beside the point. On a political level, it seems clear he has to get control quickly, get control of Kiev, get control of the major cities, but particularly get control of Kiev, the government institutions, government offices, records, etc. Minimal and depose the government, of course, establishing, at least in theory, some kind of a caretaker government that would somehow, by I guess by magic, not be seen as a complete puppet of Moscow. But how that happens, we remains to be seen. But anyway, the other aspect of this that's really critical for Moscow is that the Russian military really truly has to minimize casualties here, and I don't just mean Russian soldiers, I mean Ukrainian civilians here. It's not that this is going to be popular among Ukrainians, but if you start seeing bodies piling up here and, like I said, building to building, house to house fighting where families are being massacred, the kind of war crimes that the US has perpetrated all over the world, from Fallujah to the Central America and all sorts of other places. If you start to see that kind of bloodshed, it is a disaster for Moscow, a disaster. So, I know that some people who were commenting on some previous videos were saying, "Boy, you really hate Russia. You're really negative about Putin." It's not about hating or liking or about feeling positive or negative. It's about simply describing what is actually happening, and what is actually happening is Russia has invaded Ukraine, and it doesn't seem to be going very well. At least not right now. Um, and like I said, the minimizing of casualties is really critical here, because if Russia is going to move towards any kind of normalization or renormalization with Europe and with other members of the global community, they're really going to have to make sure that it is, not in the wake of thousands of dead Ukrainians and, war crimes tribunals and all the rest of it. Anyway, we shall see about that. But the reason I bring up normalization is because that really leads us into the economic question. This is the dominant issue for today. Again, I'm recording in the evening here in the US on February 26th. Breaking news of the last few hours was that the United States and the British and the Europeans have jointly decided to basically freeze the Russians out of the SWIFT transaction system. That's the international system for making financial transactions. That is really one of the backbones of global capitalism. I mean, it is really at the heart of everything that happens, the move, the flow of money internationally. So this is a huge development. This is not a surprise in the sense that it was something that was uh, known to be within the toolbox. I've been talking about this for years and years in the context of Iran. Iran has dealt with a sort of sanctions regime that has frozen them out of the SWIFT system and out of a number of other systems, and they have sort of had to create alternative arrangements in order to get around all of that. But Iran is not Russia. Just the volume of energy alone that Russia sells to Europe, that is dwarfs what you're talking about in terms of financial transactions that the Iranians had to scramble to make up. So how the Russians are expecting to sort of get around this issue, it's not entirely clear to me. And again, just to be very clear, SWIFT is necessary in order to settle transactions, in order to pay debts, whether it's movement of goods and services or what have you. SWIFT is the way in which banks are able to move that money, more or less. Money being digital in a sense. Anyway, um, so it's about debt transactions and settlements, but it's also about access. It's about access to international bank reserves, right? And if the Russians, and specifically the Russian central bank, which is now apparently, from the latest indications, going to also specifically be sanctioned, if the Russian central bank cannot access those international reserves that they've saved, the hundreds of billions of dollars, if they can't access that, then they might as well not have it at all. Right? This is something that, again, I've pointed to this several times in previous videos, but if you're a Latin America watcher, then you've seen this play out before. Right? This has happened to Venezuela, really, actually, quite recently, in fact. So what you're seeing is a sort of economic noose tightening around Putin. And you know, all of us who kind of give Putin the benefit of the doubt, sort of, at least at the beginning, the benefit of the doubt, that is to say that he's rational and clear thinking and has sort of taken stock of all of the risks and decided that this was, an appropriate course of action. I mean, it's beginning to seem more and more irrational. How could he not have figured that this would happen, and or already contingency plan to make sure that if it does happen, Russia was going to be okay? I mean, presumably that's what Putin's people are saying, right? The various Kremlin apologists, like, the various blogs and Russian disinformation media ecosystem, and the Pepe Escobars of the world, and all of these other lunatics for whom, Putin is like, God incarnate, right? These people would all tell you that, Putin has calculated all of this, and of course they have alternative arrangements, and they'll be able to do A, B, C, D, and E with the Chinese and with this and that, and it'll get around all of that. But the reality is that that's not actually how the global economic system works. And Russia is very much integrated in this global economic system. Who do you think controls the real capital in the country? It is the oligarchs. You think the oligarchs aren't dependent upon the global financial flows and this sort of international financial architecture? Of course they are. They have real estate investments, and yeah, I mean, I'm not even going to try to explain or even wrap my head around all of the different assets and things that these people control. So, this is going to be a major problem, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means for Putin politically here in a second. 620 billion was the number. 620 billion dollars in reserves is what Putin claims Russia has. Now ask yourself how much of that 620 is now going to be permanently out of reach for the Russians. I mean, if a significant portion of that is out of reach for them, then they have badly miscalculated. Putin specifically will have badly miscalculated, and it remains to be seen. Maybe not. Maybe he's going to pull some kind of rabbit out of his hat, and the West will have to sit back and marvel yet again at the stroke of pure genius from the man in the Kremlin. Um, we are looking at a situation where inflation is going to continue to rise. I don't know how much. I'm not somebody who wants to make, economic forecasts of that kind, but it does seem to reason that if inflation was already hovering at 7, 8, 9%, the volatility now might be, enough to push it into a range that is intolerable for a big section of the population. One of the things that I was reading about just earlier today was analysis of public opinion in Russia, and it's very complicated because it's not as straightforward anti-war or pro-war as you may think. There's a lot of apathy. There's a lot of sort of trust in Putin. Putin does have a significant base of support, despite all of the sort of disappointments and gap between rich and poor and mismanagement of COVID and financial stagnation and all of these other things, or economic stagnation in terms of economic development. He still has a lot of support, right? But it's complicated because the more people are forced to think about what Russia's doing in Ukraine, I think the more unpopular this is going to become. I think for a lot of Russians, they weren't even really thinking that this would happen, and to the extent that they did think it would happen, they didn't think much about it. But if Russian boys start coming home in body bags in their thousands, as is allegedly already happening, if you believe some of the Ukrainian sources, this is going to be hard to cover up. This is not going to be like a couple of hundred Wagner mercenaries that got killed in Syria because they tangled with U.S. Air support and Syria and their sort of Syrian allies. I mean, this is not something that's going to get swept under the rug. This is going to be a major scandal in Russia. And the other aspect of this is the sanctions are undoubtedly going to create conflict between Putin and the oligarchs, that support him. Again, you have to keep in mind Russia's political system is such that it is not a straightforward autocracy in the way that you might think. Yes, Putin is sort of autocratic in a sense, right? Yes, he sort of is the head of this sort of kleptocratic gangster state, but it is in essence a system of balancing various oligarchs and their sometimes competing, sometimes overlapping interests. And Putin's ability to sort of manage all of these different competing interests to the benefit of all of them, essentially, uh, that is really what maintains Putin's power. It's what sort of undergirds the legitimacy of his, authority and his presidency. And now he could potentially be endangering not only the billions upon billions that these parasites have sort of siphoned out of Russia and gathered unto themselves, he might be threatening their lives, their ability to travel, their ability to send their kids to universities in European capitals or in the United States. It might be certainly threatening their real estate investments in Manhattan and in Hong Kong and wherever else. So this is going to be complicated. This is going to be very complicated for Putin because he is now going to feel the kind of blowback that I'm not sure he was necessarily prepared for. And again, not all of the oligarchs are the same. I mean, some of them are really, fervently patriotic, sort of nationalist Russians, but some of them aren't. Some of them are very Western facing, sort of international in outlook, cosmopolitan, as it were, Europeans in their minds, etc. So you're going to see some potential conflicts emerging from that. Now, all right, I'm already approaching past 15 minutes, so let me wrap it up with one last subject that came up today, and I want to address it only because I don't know how much validity we can really give to it. And this is the story of these Chechen soldiers that apparently have been sent by Putin to go fight in Ukraine, right? This is the sort of strange kind of proto is not the right word here, just fascist Chechen leader Kadyrov, and this sort of bizarre semi-theocratic dictatorship, sub-dictatorship that he runs in Chechnya. um, Within the sort of under the auspices of Putin's regime. These Chechen soldiers are apparently going to Ukraine, allegedly, right? Assuming this isn't some kind of psychological warfare from the Kremlin designed to make people fear some kind of barbarian invasion, to play on their anti-Muslim, mindset or something. That absolutely could be possible. But assuming it's true, there's another element here, right? The Chechens don't just go to Ukraine to fight for Russia and to conquer Ukraine. That then becomes a broader kind of war because the Chechens bring with them, of course, their enemies, right? They will then create a war inside Ukraine between the Chechens, presumably, and the so-called Euro-Ichkarians, that is to say, that those who fled Chechnya after the final consolidation of power, after Putin's takeover and Kadyrov's installation and so forth. After the Second Chechen War, there was, you could call it an expulsion or a sort of entering into exile of all of these opposition figures, many of whom are connected to international terror networks, or at least were at one time, potentially still are, unclear, what those connections are. But anyway, if you believe some of the more paranoid quarters of Russian social media and so forth, and I do to some extent in some ways, um, they are worried that the presence of these Chechens means that these sort of Ishkarians, or Euro Ishkarians as they're allegedly being called, then creates a potential for a jihad war, right? That you're going to see the mobilization of terror cells and or criminal gang networks, many of whom probably have been raping and pillaging and enriching themselves in Syria and or in other parts of the North Africa, potentially during the Libyan civil war, etc. Right. So these sorts of criminal gangs, this is not some conspiracy, right? These are very real criminal networks. Turkish intelligence is connected to them. They have been all throughout the Syria conflict, as we know through the whole history of the Islamic State and the various criminal gangs that it spawned, etc. Right. This then complicates the picture even further. I'm not saying Ukraine becomes a jihad, right? I'm saying that if these Chechens really do enter into the war directly in this way, in large numbers, it is inevitable that they're going to find themselves being targeted by their enemies who have been sitting in Europe for the last 20 years, licking their wounds after essentially being massacred by Putin's forces, right? So there is a whole complicated history in the post-Soviet period with Chechnya and the various regions of the Caucasus, those that did break away, those that didn't, the whole series of conflicts that erupted through there. All of that is relevant. right? So when you see this sort of, I don't know if you saw the video, but it's like something out of Dune, right? This very fascistic looking cadres of forces from Chechnya, and you just have to sit and ask yourselves, I mean, are they insane? Are they insane? Do they not realize what kind of a conflict this could potentially create, what it could set the stage for? Anyway, I don't know if we need to feel any more anxiety about what's going on in Ukraine and Eastern Europe, but if you didn't already feel nervous, well, the introduction of these Chechen forces, I think, could potentially make us all a lot more nervous. What does this actually mean? Does this then internationalize the Ukraine war? Does Ukraine become something akin to Syria, where people from all over the world, whether they're far right wing forces or Islamic forces or just generally military contractors, mercenaries, whomever from around the world, are going to come there to fight Russian soldiers? What an absolute nightmare and an absolute disaster for Putin and the Kremlin. If that's the case, then quagmire is a vast, vast understatement. And if this is supposed to be part of a so called war on terror, then Putin has absolutely sealed his fate with an utter historic blunder of just absolutely epic proportions. What can you say? If that is the outcome of all of this, then it is utter disaster for Russia. But we shall see. Of course, our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine, people who are, as we speak, under bombs, under siege. Our thoughts are with them and with everyone around the world whose loved ones are under threat in Ukraine, and of course also for those anti-war voices in Russia, never to be forgotten, what they're facing. All right. Talk to you all real soon.